reoccurrence, I know that from the work I've seen of yours anyway, you make the connection that Nietzsche could be a transhumanist. He could be supporting some transhumanist thinking. But then when I think of eternal reoccurrence and transhumanism, they seem like to contradict one another, because if I understand eternal reoccurrence, it's basically just like this infinite loop that you're just in this cycle forever. And therefore, if you're in this cycle forever, there's no progress, which is that, the opposite of what transhumanists are saying. I mean, there can be progress, but it's always just going to be a loop, if that makes sense. So
exactly.
You want to
exactly. No, you're right. But there's no tension between that. But there is progress within the loop. But at the end, sort of, there will be one stage at which everything in the world, one state of the Earth, will be identical to a prior one, and then the loop will start again. And that's actually a thought which has a long history in philosophy, which goes back to Heraclitus. And Heraclitus was the one who made me first aware of that concept of the eternal recurrence. He referred to it as the great year, and he said how long it lasts. Obviously, it's just a metaphorical amount of years. He said the great year lasts 10,800 years. So 10,800, meaning a very, very long period of time. And then there were Pythagoreans, there were Stoics, who also embraced the idea of the eternal recurrence before. So Nietzsche was only someone, I mean, he picked it up and he tried to justify or explain this thought. He thinks it corresponds to scientific ways of thinking. And he even considered studying physics, already having been a professor of classics in Basel. He considered moving to Paris for 10 years to study physics and to prove that the eternal recurrence is a plausible scientific hypothesis. And he played around with the thought a lot, in particular in his unpublished writings. I mean, in the writings he didn't publish himself. They were published after his death in his notebooks, and they are now accessible. So he played around a lot with different reflections in order to show that the eternal recurrence is a plausible scientific hypothesis. Actually, all the reflections which he put forward are non sequitur. Actually, the premise, the conclusion does not follow from the premises. But he had some very good thoughts. And again, in the forthcoming book, actually, my final chapter, I directly deal with the eternal recurrence, with the great year, because I actually think it's the best possible, the only possible, the most plausible option for a non-dualistic way of thinking, for having a kind of a reply to the question of the meaning of any lives, of finding something, a meaning which goes beyond our own limited lifestyle, life periods of life periods on Earth. Something, but it goes beyond our limited lifespan, but has a relevance for our lives. Because if so, let's assume this is actually this is actually the case, the eternal recurrence. That means whatever you do right now, whatever we do, us talking, it will recur infinitely often. So that means, you better watch out that you're making some good choices, no? Because whatever you do is that you will have to do infinitely often. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's not, in the end, it's not up to you. There's no, in such a way of thinking, there's no possibility of you actually having a free will. Free will in a metaphysical sense does not make any sense in that way, in that such a frame of mind, because obviously you've done it infinitely often before. And the right way of phrasing this is actually not even, it's not the next turn or the turn after, because it's always the same. because only recurrence means there's only one cycle. It's not like the n plus 1, n plus 2, but it's always the same cycle, because if there is identity in the strongest sense, there is not another, because another would have to imply a linear progress of time. And that's a challenge. Just to reflect upon these issues means our way of thinking. Whenever we think about time, we think about time in a linear way. We think about there's today, there's tomorrow, there's a before, there's a later. So our ways of thinking about time always imply a linear directedness. But when we embrace that eternal recurrence, in the end, there is no linear directed time. It's a circular time, and that's radically different way from how we experience the world. So we always experience the world in this linear world, but once we start thinking about it, and even when we start thinking about it scientifically, actually the circular way of embracing, of conceptualizing time makes a lot of sense. And all the various premises, and actually both in a former monograph and in the one in a book on Nietzsche, on metaphysics without truth, but also in the next one, I'm analyzing the various premises necessary for the eternal recurrence to occur. So which premises are metaphysically necessary in order for the universe to actually have the eternal recurrence of everything? And the basic thought is, we need to eliminate any kind of infinity in our premises, because infinity cannot be conceptualized, because no infinity can be completed. If we think about completion, we only can complete a finite amount of progress. Infinity can never be completed. So in this way, we get rid of infinities in our ways of thinking and our premises on what the world consists in. So instead of having an infinite energy, we have a finite amount of energy. Instead of an infinite amount of states which energy can take in, we only have a finite amount of stages which energy can take in. Instead of not having a determinate law, we need to have a determinate law which governs the world. Not like the four laws which we now have in physics, like gravitation, electromagnetic, the strong and the weak force. But what the physics actually tries to combine these four forces into one great unified theories. So we need to have one law governing basically the world, one determined a law. And so if the entire realm of energy which we have in the world is finite, if the state the energy can take in is finite, so all the energy state get altered and get altered again. But if there's only a finite amount of states and a finite amount of energy, we will get to one state in the progress, in the history of the world, where all the possible stages have already taken place. So if you have the same type of arrangement of energy, identical to a prior one, and you have the same law governing the energy, it's necessary that the cycle starts again. It's a necessary way of thinking, also in a scientific manner, about the cosmology. And all of these various premises are actually plausible from a scientific perspective, and they are shared by physicists. Actually, there are quite a few physicists who regard this as a plausible interpretation of the universe. And